I want to welcome everybody here to our live author reading for the Book Fairies Read-a-Thon. It is the month of May, and you know what that means. It is our third annual Read-a-Thon, and this is really a fundraising and awareness month. We want to wrap our arms around literacy, all types of literacy, and get people reading. And what better way to have live author readings? The Read-a-Thon is still, you can still get involved in the Read-a-Thon if you want. You can create a page, make a donation. The information will be in the chat on Facebook, so you can do that as well. We are at, I think, $63,000 of our $100,000 goal, so that's pretty cool. But we need to get there. We only have, what do we have? 20 days, 21 days left to get there. So without further ado, I want to introduce, we have Allison Richmond with us today. Allison is a USA Today best-selling author, also a #1 international best-selling author of several historical novels, including The Velvet Hours, The Garden of Letters, The Secret of Clouds, and The Lost Wife, 2 of which you read with us over the last 2 years. This is your third time's a charm.
Trick.
Yes, exactly. And you're soon to be released, The Thread Collectors, which you co-wrote with Shauna J. Edwards, and you're going to be reading from that tonight.
Yeah.
We're super excited about that. Allison graduated from Wellesley College with a degree in art history and Japanese studies. You yourself, which we have to talk about, you're a painter yourself, so I want to talk a little bit about that. And your novels combine your deep love of art, historical research, and travel. Allison's novels have been published in 25 languages, incredible, and have reached the bestseller list both in the United States and abroad. And you're a Long Island girl, and you live on Long Island with your husband and your children, and we're super excited to have you back again. And welcome, Allison.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be joining you and participating in the Read-a-Thon. You do such amazing work. I mean, your whole initiative to make sure that every child has a book in their hands and loves to read, and that's a lifelong passion. I think that's just so wonderful. So I'm happy to be here for the third time. I hope I'll be here again and again every time you do it.
Yes, you're always so warm and receptive, and we love that. So thank you so much. I'm going to let you read for a little while, and then I'm going to shut down. And then when I come back, we'll do some talking and questions from anybody that has any. So
okay, perfect.
Enjoy.
Yes. Okay, so I have to put my reading glasses on so I can read from, this is going to be published, it's called The Thread Collectors. It's a historical novel that I co-wrote with Shauna J. Edwards. It's a Civil War book, and I was telling Eileen that it's loosely inspired in part by my own family tree. I have 2 great uncles who fought in the Civil War, but they fought on different sides. So growing up, I heard from my grandmother how when one brother went down to Mississippi and joined the Confederacy, and his other brother stayed in New York and enlisted in the Civil War as a musician, how this permanently divided our family forever when they chose opposite sides of slavery and just in general in the war. This book is co-written with a dear friend of mine, as I said, Shauna J. Edwards, who pulled from her own Black roots in Louisiana to create the character of William, who was also a musician, but a Black musician during the Civil War. And so in this novel, both William and the other Union musician, who is inspired by my family tree, discover an unexpected friendship on the battleground. While back home, their beloveds who are working to bring them safely home use their own sewing skills in order to sort of aid the Union initiative. Stella, who is the Black woman back in Louisiana, will be using repurposed cloth to create maps that are used for enslaved men to try and join up into the army. While back home, Jacob Kling's beloved is making quilts for the Union Army. So you have 4 very important characters, William and Jacob, both musicians, and Stella and Lily, who are both very good with their needle and thread. So here we begin in chapter 1. New Orleans, Louisiana, March 1863. She opens the door to the Creole cottage, just wide enough to ensure it's truly him. Outside, the pale moon is high in the sky, illuminating only half of William's face. Stella reaches for his sleeve and pulls him aside. He is dressed to run. He wears his good clothes, but has chosen his attire thoughtfully, ensuring the colors will camouflage in the wilderness that immediately surround the city. In his hand, he clasped a brown canvas case. They have only spoken in whispers during their clandestine meetings about his desire to fight, to flee. The city of New Orleans teeters on the precipice of chaos, barely contained by the Union forces occupying the streets. Homes abandoned, businesses boarded up. Stella's master comes back from the front every 6 weeks, each time seeming more battered, bitter, and restless than the last. William sets down his bag and draws Stella close into his chest, his heartbeat accelerating. He lifts a single slim finger, slowly tracing the contours of her face, trying to memorize her one last time. "You stay here, no matter what," he murmurs into her ear. "You must keep safe. And for a woman like you, better to hide and stay unseen than venture out there." In the shadows, he sees her eyes shimmer, but she balances the tears from falling, an art she has been taught long ago, when she learned that survival, not happiness, was the real prize. Stella slips momentarily from William's arms. She tiptoes toward a small wooden chest. From the top drawer, she retrieves a delicate handkerchief with a single violet embroidered in its center. With materials in the city now so scarce, she has had to use the dark blue thread from her skirt's hem to stitch the tiny flower on a swatch of white cotton cut from her petticoat. So you'll know you're never alone out there," she says as she closes William's finger around the kerchief. He has brought something for her too, a small speckled cowrie shell that he slips from a worn indigo-colored pouch. The shell and its cotton purse are his two most sacred possessions in the world. He puts the pouch, now empty, back into his pocket. "I'm coming back for that, Stella." William smiles as he looks down at the talisman in his beloved's hand. "And for you too. Everything will be different soon." She nods, takes the shell, and feels its smooth lip against her palm. There was a time such cowrie shells were used as a form of currency for their people. Shells threaded on pieces of string exchanged for precious goods. Now the shell is both worthless and priceless as it's exchanged for safekeeping between the lovers. There is no clock in her small home. William too wears no watch, yet both of them know they have already tarried too long. He must set out before there is even a trace of sunlight, and even then his journey will be fraught with danger. "Go, William," she says, pushing him out the door. Her heart breaks, knowing the only protection she can offer him is a simple handkerchief, her love stitched into it by hand. He leaves as stealthily as he arrived, a whisper in the night. Stella falls back into the shadows of her cottage. She treads silently into her bedroom, hoping to wrap herself tightly in the folds of the quilt that bring her so much comfort. "You all right?" A soft sound emerges in the dark. "Amine?" Stella's voice breaks as she says the woman's name. "Yes, I'm here." Amine enters the room, her face brightened by a small wax candle in her grip. In the golden light, she sits down on the bed and reaches for Stella's hand, still clutching the tiny shell, which leaves a deep imprint in her palm. "Really strong," Amine says over and over again. "You're gonna make it, I know." Stella doesn't answer. A flicker of pain stabs her from the inside, and she finally allows her tears to run. Chapter 2, Camp Parapat, Jefferson, Louisiana. The 10 miles journey from New Orleans to the army camp that was perched between Lake Pontchartrain and the river had been treacherous and lengthy. William avoided all roads at any cost, regardless of whether they were dirt or paved. He didn't know what his mas would discover when he had fled, but he was all too aware of the slave catchers camped right outside the city. Any man they captured would suffer greatly. Lashings that ripped the skin off their back, fleur-de-lis brand markings the bearer as untrustworthy. And for those with particularly brutal masters with enough slaves to spare, bodies doused with kerosene and lit on fire, their burning flesh a reminder to the others on the plantation that it was never worth it to run. He took the route that Stella had advised, first through the swampland, then hugging the bayous and creeping through boggy marshes and wetlands that had been navigated to reach higher ground. The roots of bald cypress trees and tupelo gums intertwined beneath the murky water of the ravines, causing William to stumble countless times. He had nearly been caught 3 times since he'd left Stella, but he kept running, hearing her voices in his head urging him on. He was driven by his mother's spirit too, each stretched toward freedom, defying those who robbed her of song. In the hour right before dawn, the sound of barking dogs was dangerously close. He threw himself into the fetid water, hoping to evade the bloodhounds, shivering until the patrollers finally moved away. He reached the enlistment camp by daybreak, where he found hundreds of men already in line, eager to join the Union cause. Some had traveled for days through back alleys or through more dangerous open fields. Like William, all of them had to evade mercenaries eager to beat and shackle them before returning them to their masters for a rich reward. The man in front of William stood barefoot, the cuffs of his pants reduced to a ragged edge of fringe. Fingers balled at his sides, he inched up the snaking line to the medical surgeon's tent, leaving a stamp of blood with each step. The dry earth, greedy for every ounce of moisture, drank the man's dark footprint almost instantly, only to have it replaced with another. Next, outside the mouth of the tent's entrance, one of the Union soldiers waved another man inside. William looked down at his own narrow feet. The pair of waterlogged and sweat-stained calfskin Oxfords he had on were not the typical shoes of a contraband man running from slavery. His herringbone trousers had a gash down the side. His tweed jacket was ripped at the elbow, and somewhere between New Orleans and Jefferson County, he had lost his hat. Yet despite his harrowing journey, his shoes remained miraculously intact. Inside his jacket, tucked within the pocket of his waistcoat, he located the handkerchief Stella had embroidered. He surreptitiously ran his fingers over the small flowers she'd stitched carefully with blue thread. Even now, with the stench of rot and death hung in the air, the buzzing of flies, the intense hunger in his belly, thoughts of Stella were his constant companions. He brought the white cotton cloth to his nose and inhaled it, desperately searching for the last traces of her distinct scent. William knew breath was not something that always came from the lungs, but could break forth from the heart and mind as well, filling a body with life when it needed it most. In the corner of the tent where William was told to undress, Jacob Kling sat bent over a thick ledger. Dark curls sprouted from beneath his cap, and a smudge of black ink stained his index finger as he recorded the medical surgeon's clinical observations about the prior recruit. 22 years old, Negro, 5'9", weight 175 pounds. Despite superficial wound to left foot, a solid build and determined spirit, qualified for military duty. The medical surgeon chose his words carefully when Jacob first arrived at the examination tent to assist with the note-taking. It's a sorry situation. We can't accept every man who wants to join up, despite the lengths that they may have taken to get here, he explained as he opened his black leather physician's bag and arranged his tools on a side table. The Army asks me to separate out the strong from the weak. I have given up determining whether a man is a fugitive, the doctor remarked, noting the futility of dividing the recently emancipated from those who had fled from bondage. Remember, these men will not be lifting muskets, but rather wielding shovels, pickaxes, and hoes. We can only take the ones who are free from both bodily defects and have the sufficient sense to follow orders. He cleared his throat and pulled his ash-colored beard. In other words, Private Kling, my job is rather straightforward. It is not to choose who is in every way good, but to reject who is positively unfit. The doctor always began his examinations with each candidate's head, ears, and eyes, and then continued on to inspect their teeth, neck, and chest. He also checked their hands and feet over carefully. Earlier that morning, a young man had taken off his shirt, and both Jacob and the doctor had found it impossible to keep their composure when they saw a thick blanket of scar tissue covering the man's back. The man tried to bring his hands over his head, but the painful scars limited his range of motion. His arms only lifted halfway, his hands barely reaching the level of his ears. Now, as William entered the tent, the doctor readjusted his focus. His eyes fell on William's shoes and his once elegant but now damaged clothes. "Don't just stand there. Get undressed so I can examine you." William placed down his rucksack, removed his jacket, and slowly began to unbutton his vest and shirt. He knew he was far slighter than nearly every man in the line that afternoon. Having never worked a field, his body had not obtained the thick ropes of muscles his fellow slaves had developed. Instead, when he had been 6 years old, he had been plucked from his mama's pallet and delivered to the big house to amuse the master's wife and his nascent talent. The doctor placed a stethoscope upon William's chest. "Heart and lungs clear," he said. "Slight build, fit for service." He turned over William's palm. "How oddly free of calluses," he muttered underneath his breath. "Any skills?" "Musician, sir," William answered quietly, but the doctor was no longer listening. Okay, so that's a taste of the Thread Collectors.
And it's a good taste. That is that's a good taste.
Okay.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I'm emotional when he couldn't lift his arms, and just like there's just so much to it. So much to it.
Oh, well, thank you. I mean, it was very important for Sean and I to paint a picture that you could see of what it was like at that time and what, men were fleeing from. And for me, my writing always is very visual. I always try and say, like, I feel like I am painting a picture for you, that you're standing there and you're watching it all unfold. But these are difficult images, to hear, but it really gives you a sense. I mean, it is making this time period come alive. I think it's really important.
Yeah, it's palpable. You can visualize it coming off the pages. I could just like him not being able to raise his arms, and
That's because it's so
it's just incredible. So tell us a little bit about like what inspired you to write the book, and how did you and Shauna come together on this? Like what?
Yes. So I had been dreaming of writing a Civil War novel for some time, probably going back at least 10 years, because I've known Shauna at least 10 years as well. And as I told you, prior, there is some history in my own family line. I am Jewish. I have, two great uncles, as I mentioned when I, before starting to read, who fought on different sides during the Civil War, and that this permanently basically divided my family forever. I don't know my Southern relatives, but I definitely, my family is, an offshoot of Jacob Kling. So when I also learned that Jacob Kling was a musician, I found that particularly fascinating too, that there was some musician who had enlisted on my family tree. But that said, that was really in the back part of my mind. Writing about the Civil War is very different than writing about, I've written 3 books that take place in World War II. Mm-hmm. I have a book that takes place in Meiji period Japan, another one, in South America during the Dirty Wars there. So I've been all over the place historically, but the Civil War was going back even further in history, in a time where I think it's often, there's an aversion to reading of that time period because we think of it as being so much, in the battlefield, very almost dusty, and like, do we really want to go there? But it's a very timely issue too, especially as we were talking before about sort of, the divisiveness within our country now, the, polarized politics, the sense that families have been divided. So it is particularly timely. And so a lot of that kind of came into play when I think Sean and I came together to write this book, but I had been discussing it with her for over 10 years. I mean, Sean and I have been, really good friends. She was a literature major at Harvard. So she's always loved books. She always dreamt of writing books. And I would say about 10 years ago, I saw this documentary. It was a documentary called Burying the Civil War Dead. And it was by Rick Burns, not Ken Burns, the more, well-known brother. But this particular documentary really focused on how after the Civil War, there was this call to arms, particularly on the Union side, to try and retrieve the dead Union soldiers who were left sometimes unburied, sometimes buried in the South, because it was the deadliest war to this day in U.S. history. And that the quartermaster general basically put out this call to arms for people who had buried their, comrades, like who had made maps of where they had buried them, who had written in their journal where they left, one of their beloved friends, and how Congress actually basically, put forth an initiative to reclaim these soldiers and bring them back home on the north side. The southern women actually had to do their own fundraising to get their, their husbands back from, up north, back down south. But there was, in this particular documentary, there was a focus also on Black soldiers who had signed up like William to fight, but who, as I mentioned Sean and I mentioned in the description, were really forced to sort of use shovels and picks and were burying the Civil War soldiers, the white Civil War soldiers, and in some cases, obviously the Black as well. But the sense, I immediately had this sort of epiphany of like, what if a woman was going down south to find her husband who was missing and she wasn't sure if he was dead, and a map had been created of where he had been left. I'm not giving anything away because I'm not saying whether, one of these soldiers dies, but the whole inspiration for the book began when I had this idea. And so over drinks with my friend, I always talked around books, and my friend said, well, what if his beloved, this Black soldier, makes a map and embroiders the map so that nothing happens to the map? And and she sort of brought in this whole angle of textiles in the Black community, that, sewing and things to preserve heritage and history. And that would be so interesting. And we just always sort of talked about it, and she would throw out ideas. Her mother owns Stella Jones Gallery, which is a gallery that really supports and highlights Black artists in New Orleans. It's been in existence for a long time, and it's very established. And so she has a very rich, background in textiles and in art. And so, I would say in 2020 in the spring, as sort of, social injustice was sort of coming, really being exposed in our country for how terrible and brutal it is, we sort of had this idea to come together and to write this book together from, both of our heritage and, both of our backgrounds, and to sort of create this book that shows two perspectives that are often unexplored in this, in Civil War fiction, at least, one Black, one Jewish, this beautiful friendship that sort of tethers these two men who also are connected by music, but then also what's happening, and, it's satellite wise, like with their women back home, and how eventually those women come together. So it's a complicated story with a lot of history and a lot of layers. And I think both of us pulling from our roots and our heritage, it makes it so much better, so much richer, so much more authentic. So I'm so excited to share it. This, comes out August 30th.
That's great. And the timeliness of it is because, it shows you how far we've come and really how far we have to go. Exactly. But it's also wonderful that the two of you brought you both have different lenses and different lives and different visions. And, we can all learn something from the book in general, I think, because we can all, that's where we all need to be. We all need to be at the table together and listening.
For us, we so wanted to create this sort of bridge between the two communities and to show this sort of bond of humanity that exists in all of us. It was so important, not just to show what divides, but also which bridges. I think that's so important.
We're more alike than we are different. We just, like I said before, we let our emotions take over and our IQ goes down, because you just, you don't really allow yourself to, pay attention to really what matters, but we are more alike than we are different. Also, we have one, what is the hardest part of the book to write? What was the hardest part of the book to write?
So every book, it's the same. The first 60 pages are the hardest part to write.
Oh, that's so interesting.
You really have to set the stage. I mean, it's so important to draw. I mean, you're all readers who are listening. So you have to draw the reader in and propel them to turn the next page and want them to feel that they are engaged and they can see what you're describing. So that process of writing the first 60 pages could take 3 months, to feel that it's right, to establish who the characters are, what are their backgrounds, what's at stake. That's all like in the beginning to sort of get you engaged. So once that's established, I feel like that's the foundation. It's much easier to sort of, it sort of takes a life of its own, and that they start going. But it's hard because you're really creating characters, you're birthing them out of nowhere. They have, you have to give them life, and you have to make them interesting and complex, and also not overwhelm the reader that they put the book down. And we're also busy, and I think it's easily more than ever to be distracted. So, it's a delicate balance of how do you bring that in and set the stage for what's going to come.
I was just going to say that kind of, as you said it, I was like, oh, that's interesting. And then I'm like, you know what? It makes sense because you have to make sure that you have to hook them.
Yeah.
Right. You got to hook them. I can't be like, oh, I don't know if I really want to go further on this. But you have to hook them. But you also have to set the stage, let the players, and really get us to know who the players are, and get us invested in the characters. So that makes sense.
And that's so important. Like, you're not going to read a 350-page book unless you're invested in the characters and you're rooting for them, and you have to know their backstory. That you have to, your heart has to connect with their heart. So their backstory is really essential. How did they get to this place? What you want to root for them and hope that they succeed.
Absolutely. You're like, I'm going to one more page and I'm going to go to bed. And then you're like, oh, are you kidding me? I got to find out what happens.
Well, I always write very short chapters. My chapters are like, usually no more than 5 pages, because I like to imagine these mini canvases that you're seeing, and then you can sneak in one more. It's not so overwhelming, but you can see it and feel very intensely in those limited pages.
You'd be like my sister Fran. She'll read it. I went to bed at 7 o'clock in the morning. I'm like, why? She's like, I had to finish a book. I go, you're nuts. You're nuts. In researching and writing the Thread Collectors, was there something you learned that shocked you? Oh,
that's such a good question. And yes, I never learned in my history classes about the terrible racism that was in New York during the Civil War. Like, I just always, in my mind, thought it was very much, the North was against slavery and racism, and the South was, for slavery and, for the, cotton trade, and didn't have any respect for, Black life. But researching this book, we learned, all sort, or I'm sure Shauna knew already, I did not personally know about, for example, the burning of the colored asylum in New York, which was this it was an orphanage for the most part of children who were set in they were in the care of people other than their parents, and they were being taught there as well. These young children, many of the children were orphaned when their fathers had enlisted in the to fight in the Civil War, but it was set on fire by people who used using all these racial slurs as they torched the place and tried to basically kill these children and their teachers. So that was incredibly shocking to learn about, and as the mob cheered, and things like that. So learning, we really felt it was very important to highlight that, so that one of Lily, the character, writes about it in a letter to Jacob, saying that this has happened up north, because we wanted to open up the eyes of our readers to know about history of things that aren't, haven't been taught in books.
It's that you bring up a good point, because it is teaching history that for some people weren't taught. And I think no matter what side you're on, I think we want to know reality and what has gone on. And this book gives us a little bit of information and knowledge. We talked before we started about the amount of Black soldiers that went into the
over 180,000 Black men enlisted to fight in the Union Army, which is an enormous amount of men who risked incredible hardship, to even just get to the point of being able to enlist, having to risk, as I describe it, as Sean and I describe in the first chapter, what was at risk if they were caught from running away from their masters. And then to put that in contrast, the Jewish population during the time of the Civil War was less than 0.5%. So there was, on both sides, I think the total they think is about 8,000 Jewish men enlisted to fight in the Civil War. So, it's both of them have not been as sort of explored as lenses to write, I think, historical fiction that makes it unique. But, what we wanted to do was also create characters that were incredibly human, that you're rooting for, that have these interesting backstories, and you're seeing their plights from different perspectives.
It's tremendous, and I think it's very timely, and I think we should all pick it up and learn a little bit about from it. I have one last question, because it goes to writing with collaborating on a writing. How does that work? Like, who writes what part of it, and how does it gel together?
So in this case, because I was describing that I just worked on another collaboration for a book that comes out next April called The Friday Night Club, and that book had 3 authors. In that case, one of the authors wrote there's a modern day story that was been woven into the historical story. Mm-hmm. So in that case, one of the authors just did the modern day story, and then I worked with a Swedish author because it was based on a Swedish artist and her artistic circle. We would do sort of, I guess, similar to what I did with Shauna with the Thread Collectors, where we as a team discuss what would happen plot wise. Like, all the brainstorming happened before a single sentence was ever written for any chapter. So, usually, in the case with Shauna, it was every Friday night we would have a meeting and we would discuss like what was going to happen plot wise in the book. Shauna has a full-time job, so I would take and also, it was her debut, so I feel like this is like my ninth going on 10th book. So I would take the first pass where I would sort of kind of try and sketch out the scene of what we had discussed would happen. And then I would turn it into, in this case, to Shauna, and she would then write into the book. She would do the dialogue. I would sometimes put like a little, like in parentheses, need description of Louisiana, marshland, and she would put that in because she knew it. But I would prompt her to do it, and so. And then I would then go back and I would sort of make sure that it all sounded like one voice. And then she'd go back again and she would just make sure everything was perfect. So it was this constant polishing of the stone, until it was perfect. And then we would move on to the next chapter, brainstorming again and then doing it. And so it really worked really seamlessly because, she would deliver her notes or her added her additions usually by Monday. Then I would then start working on it again, and then we would revisit it Friday with my Swedish co-author for Friday Night Club, because English wasn't her first language. We would brainstorm, then I would write it, and then she would try and tweak it and make suggestions, but then I still always had to polish it to make sure it sounded like one voice, because you don't want to sound like, especially if you're writing in the third person, that there's 2 conflicting voices, and it has to feel like one author.
Yeah, you don't want it to be disjointed.
No, you don't want it to be disjointed, and it has to sound to your ear like it's the same voice. Right. So that's kind of hard. You have to really make sure that you're just constantly refining it to make sure it reads this, the same. But with Shauna, one of the things that she added that I never could have done was the dialect. I mean, she's, obviously, and also I feel like dialogue is not my favorite thing to write in general. But when you're writing, voices from the South, like to have someone who's from the South who knows that sort of rhythm of, the cadence of the words really gives a whole other, sparkle to the book when the Southern characters are speaking.
It's being respectful to the characters and the, that was you needed the voice.
It's the music.
Someone, yeah, that's great. That's great. I have one last question. I'm going to start asking everybody this. What's your favorite childhood book?
Well,
it could be either yours or for you when you had your children.
Well, growing up, I had 2. I mean, they're young. I mean, I don't even know what they'd be called young adult, but my 2, actually probably 3 favorite heroines that I read about, that I love to read, were Amelia Bedelia, Pippi Longstocking, and Ramona the Pest. But I feel like those characters were everything for me reading those series, because they had so much spunk and they were so alive. And they were often irreverent to the adults. And that was my personality. I feel like the librarian who said to me, oh, you should read Amelia Bedelia and Pippi Long, it was the same librarian at Smithtown Library. She saved me from feeling like I was always naughty in my mother's eyes. Like, my mother was always, making me feel like I was naughty, but with them, I felt like I'm not even half as naughty.
I'm an angel. You have no idea how lucky you have it.
I loved, the hijinks that they were, were capable of. And I I love Pippi Longstocking's strength and her sense of adventure. You know, those books just, I carry them in my heart because, you know, those type of female characters when you're little really make you feel, if you're like that, sort of alive and that you have a good friend.
Books can do that, right? They take you away from, they make you feel good. They make you feel normal.
You never feel alone. You never feel alone. Good book.
Never feel alone. Well, I could talk to you forever. You're so interesting. I'm so grateful to you. You're such a good friend of the Book Fairies and such a talented author. Very, very grateful. So thank you for being here and being a part of our Read-a-Thon, our 10th anniversary, and we're recognizing our founder, and which is just, you know, I'm in awe of her and respect her immensely. We stand on her shoulders. She drove around in her little van and said, I'm going to try and fix this hole. And 3.3 million books later, here we are in 10 years. So as we continue to grow, I know we'll have you in our corner cheering us on. So thank you so much. I also want to thank our sponsors for the event. We're at 62,000. We need to get to 100,000, but we wouldn't be at 62 if we didn't have the outstanding sponsors that we have, which are Mar-a-Lago Security, PC Richard, Amazon has been tremendous for us, Hofstra University, Investors Bank, they do such good stuff with us. They're like family. Serini and Associates, not only did they sponsor this event, but they sponsor us every single month with their corporate investment in us. And then we have Mazars, Nixon, Peabody, and Jovia. So if you know a company that wants to be a part of this mission, tell them to call me.
Okay, I will.
But thank you so much, Allison, and we'll see you next year.
Yes,
and hopefully
absolutely.
I'll see you before that.
Thank you so much for having me. And I, again, you know, big kudos to you and the Book Fairies.
Thank you so much.
Okay, bye.